What if I told you that a single decision, made quietly behind closed doors, has the power to send shockwaves through one of the largest Pentecostal movements in the world? Because right now, Prophet Brian K., a man praised by some as a powerful voice of God and criticized by others as dangerously misleading, is making a move that could reshape the Church of God in Christ forever. And trust me, this is not just a small ministry shift. This could be the moment that exposes cracks many never knew existed. Is Prophet Brian K. truly breaking away from Kojak? Is he preparing to build something outside the denomination that raised him? Or is there a deeper conflict happening behind the scenes, one involving power, influence, identity, and control? Once you understand the full story, you'll find yourself questioning whether this is divine obedience or spiritual rebellion disguised as revelation. Brian K. has always stood in the center of controversy. His prophecies, his authority, his confidence, his influence. His critics call him manipulative, his followers call him anointed. But regardless of opinions, one thing has always been true: his name never leaves the conversation. And this time, the discussion isn't about a sermon, a prophecy, or a viral clip. It's about a shift so significant it could change the direction of the Pentecostal world. To understand the weight of this moment, you need to understand COGIC. This isn't just another church network. This is a global denomination with legacy, structure, apostolic lineage, and generational leadership. It has shaped gospel culture, trained thousands of pastors, and influenced nearly every major Black Pentecostal movement. So when a figure like Brian K. begins stepping outside the structure, people notice, and they talk. The whispers started softly. Rumors that Brian K. was planning to establish a church independent from COGIC oversight. Some said God was calling him to something greater. Others said he was stepping out of alignment. Soon, the whispers grew louder, turning into debates, arguments, and heated discussions among church leaders and members alike. So what's really happening? To understand this moment, you have to go back years before the public noticed any change, before the sermons that hinted at separation, before the shift in language, before the tension between tradition and personal revelation grew too large to ignore. Brian K. was never ordinary. Even as a teenager, he was known as a prodigy, young, sharp, charismatic, and unusually confident. When he preached, people cried. When he spoke prophetically, audiences felt chills. His ministry exploded with attention and influence. And with that influence came independence. While other leaders stayed close to the denominational system, Brian began moving differently. He formed his own ministry organization, Kingdom City Church. He created his own conferences, leadership teams, and global platforms. It didn't seem harmful at first. Many COGIC pastors also operate outside the denomination, but inside observers noticed something different. The tone shifted, the structure shifted, the authority shifted. In COGIC, leadership flows through councils, bishops, mentors, and accountability. In Brian's movement, authority flowed primarily through him, his voice, his direction, his revelation. The real turning point came when he began hosting large revival gatherings without COGIC oversight. The services drew crowds, the energy was electric, but the leadership circles watched closely, especially when he began inviting preachers and musicians from outside Pentecostal lines. Some respected, others controversial. Supporters said it showed maturity and spiritual expansion. Critics whispered that it was evidence of doctrinal drift. Then came the sermon that changed everything. Brian spoke about the danger of staying loyal to systems that had lost their oil. The room shouted, social media exploded, and church leaders took note. He never mentioned COGIC by name, but everyone understood what he meant. His message changed. The language shifted. He began emphasizing kingdom over denomination. He began teaching that obedience to God sometimes requires stepping away from structured authority. He preached about spiritual identity being bigger than organizational loyalty. To some, that sounded like freedom. To others, it sounded like the first step of departure. And now, everything is unfolding in real time. For those who truly understand how church culture works, it was clear that Brian K. had been preparing for something far bigger than what was happening on the surface. By the time whispers surfaced about him planning to lead a new church, the foundation had already been carefully placed. His followers were already being shaped to view this shift not as rebellion, but as divine obedience. His critics, however, saw something else entirely. To them, this move reeked of ego, ambition, and disruption disguised as revelation. But the real question is, why now? Why make such a bold move at the height of his influence, especially when his presence inside COGIC was already undeniable? According to those close to him, this wasn't sudden. It didn't come out of inspiration alone. It came from tension that didn't begin with theology. It began with power. Every major shift in church history has come from moments where vision collided with tradition. And for Prophet Brian K., that collision was not just predictable, it was unavoidable. For years, many within COGIC admired his fire, his passion, his prophetic accuracy, and the way he could captivate entire arenas. He brought youth, he brought relevance, he brought a fearless energy that felt new and alive. But the same qualities that drew crowds also raised concerns behind closed doors. While COGIC functioned through established leadership structures and shared authority, Brian began building his own. He formed independent boards, launched his own ministry network, opened global campuses, and created schools of prophetic training, all under his personal ministry umbrella. None of that was wrong on its own. Many leaders build beyond their denomination. But the difference here was influence. His platform began overshadowing pastors and bishops who had spent decades shaping the church. Conversations around revival shifted. Instead of district meetings or jurisdictional convocations, people were talking about Brian K.'s gatherings. His conferences became spectacles. His name became the draw. In a denomination rooted in hierarchy and accountability, this type of influence can be unsettling. Sources say discussions began among senior leadership. Some believed Brian was stepping outside the system. Others accused him of forming a structure centered on himself. And then came the rumors, unconfirmed but widely repeated, that disagreements had taken place regarding finances, platforms, and how prophetic ministry should be practiced publicly. Brian responded the only way a preacher can, through the pulpit. In one sermon, he spoke about leaders who cared more about control than purpose. To his followers, it sounded like righteous fire. To leadership, it sounded like a message directed straight at them. It was subtle but unmistakable. He was drawing his line. And then came the statement that truly shifted the atmosphere. Obedience to God sometimes requires disobedience to men. That line electrified people who felt trapped under religious systems. But it sent a chill through the leadership structure. Because in COGIC, loyalty and alignment are not just encouraged, they are expected. Soon, members and ministers alike began asking a dangerous question. Was Brian still officially under COGIC leadership, or had he quietly stepped away? No one could answer it clearly. And that confusion only fueled the movement. Meanwhile, his ministry kept growing. His live streams were pulling in thousands weekly. His conferences were selling out. His social media reach rivaled entire denominational events. What he was building was no longer just a church. It was a movement. But momentum challenges control. And momentum was exactly what Brian had. That's when the quiet conversations shifted into distance. Invitations slowed. Relationships cooled. Meetings that once happened regularly became rare. And yet Brian never publicly attacked anyone. He stayed composed, respectful, careful. His sermons carried messages between the lines. Messages only those paying attention could understand. Messages that said, "I will not be contained." The question is, what finally pushed him to break away? Because according to insiders, the final trigger was not theological disagreement, but a moment of humiliation, a moment that made staying impossible. But that breaking point didn't happen overnight. It was the result of years of pressure, misunderstanding, and the inability to fit a burning vision inside a fixed framework. On one side stood the Church of God in Christ, rooted in tradition, hierarchy, and generational structure. On the other stood Brian K., a man who believes his authority comes directly from God, not from any system of men. And now, those two worlds are no longer able to coexist. The tension between Prophet Brian K. and the traditional church structure didn't begin with disagreement over doctrine. It began when two worlds with completely different philosophies finally collided. And when that collision came, it wasn't quiet, it was inevitable. But what ultimately pushed everything past the point of return wasn't belief, it was visibility. There were murmurs, quiet, careful murmurs, that some leaders felt uneasy about how large Brian's influence had become and how little direct oversight they had over it. According to those close to the situation, private conversations were held behind closed doors, meetings where key bishops, out of concern for unity and consistency, encouraged him to remain under formal denominational covering. They wanted Kingdom City to remain within the COGIC framework, accountable to its leadership structure. But those same sources say Brian refused. Not because of ego, but because of conviction. He allegedly responded with a line that instantly changed the tone in the room. "You can't govern what God gave me." That statement, according to insiders, marked the quiet beginning of a separation no one was openly acknowledging yet. From that point on, his preaching shifted. His sermons were no longer simply about revival and renewal. They carried a sharper edge. He spoke about the weight of tradition, about the cost of authenticity, about the difference between serving God and serving systems. He preached that sometimes the ones God sends to restore the church are the very ones the church tries to silence. These messages didn't come from theory, they came from experience. The real turning point came when he was scheduled to speak at a major national event. People were expecting him. His name had already drawn anticipation, but at the last minute his name was quietly removed. No official explanation, no statement, just absence. And absence can speak louder than any microphone. Those who knew him said that moment cut deep, but it also brought clarity. The friendships he had fought to maintain within the denomination were shifting. The place he had once called home no longer felt like home. And once someone realizes that, there is no going back. His preaching became raw, unfiltered, fearless. In one now viral message, Brian declared, "Some leaders don't want prophets, they want puppets." His audience erupted in applause, but among leadership, it reportedly felt like the line had been crossed. To some, it sounded like rebellion. To his followers, it sounded like freedom. And then the announcement dropped. Brian K. would be pastoring a new church. Not under a district, not under a jurisdiction, not under any denominational authority. Independent, Spirit-led, and guided by the vision he now called Kingdom City. Almost immediately, social media lit up. Screenshots of flyers, clips of sermons, reactions from every side. Some celebrated it as a courageous act of obedience, a leader following God even when the cost was isolation. Others viewed it as pride dressed up in religious language. Debate erupted in church circles. Podcasts, YouTube commentators, and discussion forums debated his motives. Was this the fulfillment of a calling, or the climax of long-standing tension? Meanwhile, his new movement grew, and it grew fast. Younger believers, especially those who felt suffocated by structure, gravitated to him. They said they were tired of politics, tired of performance, tired of church that felt more like ceremony than encounter. In Brian, they saw passion, fire, authenticity, and a refusal to be limited by tradition. Reports from the launch of Kingdom City described an atmosphere charged with emotion. Packed seats, people crying, people shouting, people kneeling. Brian preached a message titled, "Following God When It Cost You Everything." It wasn't just a sermon, it was a declaration of identity. He spoke of Abraham leaving everything familiar. He spoke Elijah standing alone. He spoke of Jesus being rejected by his own. Each example mirrored his own journey, but as his movement expanded, criticism intensified. Some leaders warned that independence without accountability can lead to imbalance. One pastor even commented publicly that a prophet without covering is like a ship without an anchor. It was a clear shot at Brian's new path. But Brian did not respond, not with interviews, not with statements, not with social media posts. Instead, he doubled down on the work. He continued building, training, teaching, hosting revivals, leading prayer movements, and more people kept coming. In silence, he drew a line. Kingdom City was not part of Kojic. It was not a branch of anything. It was something entirely new, a ministry born from calling, raised through controversy, and carried by conviction.